Good evening, everyone, and Jai Bhim. It is an absolute honor to welcome all of you today for the talk on Moses to Dr. Ambedkar, a story of liberation theory, co-organized by Association for Social and Economic Equality, Awaz India TV, and Banal. On this occasion, I, Dr. Shilpa Hazare, extend a very warm welcome to you all. We are privileged to have such distinguished individuals among us to share their perspective on the topic. Moses and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar were both great leaders who fought for the liberation of their people from oppression. Moses, a prophet in biblical history, led the Israelis out of slavery in Egypt and guided them towards the promised land, advocating for justice and divine laws. Similarly, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of Indian Constitution, dedicated his life to the upliftment of the oppressed Dalits, challenging the rigid caste system and advocating for equality, education, and human rights. Both the figures symbolize the struggle against discrimination and the pursuit of a just society, inspiring generations with their leadership and vision. With this note, I invite all the dignitaries to please step forward and adorn the photos of our guiding luminaries with garlands. Thank you, sir.
विशेषता अमेरिका से आए हुए प्रोफेसर लॉरेंस सिमन सर, प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर सुब्रत स्वराज सर जो यूजीसी के पूर्व चेयरमैन रहे हैं, अरविंद गेडाम सर जो बानाई के अध्यक्ष हैं, और जयंत इंगड़े सर और सर डॉक्टर रवि लक्ष्मीकांत सर, आप सबका तहे दिल से स्वागत है आज के इस प्रोग्राम में। आज विशेष तौर पे ये जो लेक्चर रखा है, तो हमने अरविंद गड़म सर को रिक्वेस्ट किए थे कि बानाई भी इसमें पार्टिसिपेट करें, बानाई का भी रोल हो। तो बानाई और एसोसिएशन फॉर सोशल एंड इकोनॉमिक जस्टिस इक्वालिटी और आवाज इंडिया टीवी की तरफ से जॉइंटली आज का ये सेशन हमने विशेषता ऑर्गेनाइज किया। वक्त काफी कम था क्योंकि कई प्रोग्राम्स लगे हुए थे। इसके बावजूद मैंने थोरात सर को रिक्वेस्ट किया कि जब हमें पता चला कि प्रोफेसर लॉरेंस सिमन सर नागपुर आ रहे हैं, तो हमने रिक्वेस्ट किया कि सर आप उनका लेक्चर हम यहाँ भी रखें। हालांकि सिम्बोसिस में उनका लेक्चर था, तो मैंने कहा कि सर हम भी रखें, क्योंकि लॉरेंस सिमन सर के बारे में इसके बाद में इंट्रोडक्शन होने वाला है, लेकिन बहुत शॉर्ट में मैं आपको उनके बारे में बताता हूँ कि प्रोफेसर लॉरेंस सिमन सर ब्रांडाइस विद्यापीठ जो है यूएस का बोस्टन में, वहां पर है और पिछले 8 साल से वो कास्ट जर्नल निकालते हैं। कास्ट के इशू को ग्लोबलाइज करने में उनका अपना एक बहुत बड़ा रोल और बहुत बड़ा योगदान है। और इन्हीं के कारण अमेरिका में विशेषतः विश्वविद्यालयों में जो कास्ट बैन हुआ है, उसके ऊपर जो कानून आया है, इसका सबसे बड़ा श्रेय जो कानून जो आया है उसका प्रोफेसर लॉरेंस सिमन सर को है। तो इनके प्रयास के कारण वहां पे कास्ट बेस्ड डिस्क्रिमिनेशन जो हमारे युवाओं को होता था, वो अब रुक गया है कानून के जरिए। दूसरी इंपॉर्टेंट बात कि भारत से लगभग 100 से अधिक विद्यार्थियों को उन्होंने स्कॉलरशिप दी है अमेरिका में पढ़ने के लिए, विशेषतः ब्रांडाइज विद्यापीठ में पढ़ने के लिए। और वो कोशिश करते हैं, वो हर साल जब भारत में आते हैं तो भारत से ऐसे युवाओं को चयनित करते हैं कि वो अमेरिका जाए और अमेरिका में जाके वो पढ़े, और इसके लिए वो हमेशा यहाँ के युवा को प्रेरित करते रहते हैं। और इम्पोर्टेंट बात यह है कि बाबा साहब डॉक्टर अम्बेडकर के ऊपर हर 2 वर्ष के बाद वो इंटरनेशनल कॉन्फ्रेंस का आयोजन अमेरिका में करते हैं, और ये सबसे बड़ा एक महत्वपूर्ण उनका योगदान भी है। पिछले वर्ष मुझे भी जाने का मौका मिला था, सर ने मुझे भी इनवाइट किया था थोड़ा सर के माध्यम से, और वहां पर चीफ जस्टिस उस वक्त के थे, वो भी वहां पर आए थे, समूचे देश दुनिया से लोग वहां पर आए थे, तो काफी अच्छा आयोजन वहां पे वो हुआ था। तो और महत्वपूर्ण बात यह है कि वर्ल्ड जूइस जो एसोसिएट फाउंडेशन है उसके प्रोफेसर सर जो है अध्यक्ष हैं। तो आज उन्होंने रिक्वेस्ट जो हमारी थी उसको माना और आज वो हमारे बीच में आए हैं। वो शुरू में अपनी बात रखेंगे और उसके बाद थोड़ा सर जो है अपना समअप भी उसके संदर्भ में करेंगे, हिंदी में विशेष थोड़ा वो बताएंगे अपने को। तो मैं बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद अदा करता हूँ। तो आज का प्रयोजन यही था कि इतने बड़े व्यक्ति इंटरनेशनल लेवल पे अम्बेडकर थॉट्स को आगे बढ़ाने में बहुत बड़ा योगदान उनका रहा है, बहुत ज्यादा योगदान उनका रहा है। और ऐसे व्यक्ति जब नागपुर में आते हैं तो आप हम सब की जिम्मेदारी होती है कि उनको सुने और उनका जो कार्य है उसको भी हम जाने समझे। तो इसी के साथ मैं अपने हाँ प्रास्ताविक पे विराम देता हूँ। धन्यवाद। थैंक्स।
2 मिनट में जिस विषय पर ये आपसे बात करेंगे उसका बैकग्राउंड आपको थोड़ा सा देता हूँ। जो सब्जेक्ट है उनका फ्रॉम मोजेस टू अम्बेडकर, स्टोरी ऑफ लिबरेशन थियोलॉजी। ये जो सब्जेक्ट है ये डॉक्टर लॉरेंस साइमन ग्रेंडाइज यूनिवर्सिटी में हेलर स्कूल में पढ़ाते हैं बहुत सालों से। वो सब्जेक्ट है लिबरेशन थियोलॉजी। लिबरेशन थियोलॉजी ये जो विचार है ये लैटिन अमेरिका में 1960 में आया और उसका मतलब इतना ही था उस वक्त की जो डिफरेंट पीस थे चर्च में, उन्होंने ये कहा कि रिलीजन के जो विचार है उसका वो रिलीजन ने गरीबों की मुक्ति करने के लिए काम करना चाहिए। सो लिबरेशन थियोलॉजी का मतलब ये है कि ऐसा धर्मशास्त्र जिस धर्मशास्त्र के माध्यम से मुक्ति हो गरीबों की मार्जिनलाइज सेक्शन। तो ये नया विचार था क्रिश्चियनिटी में, लेकिन उन्होंने आगे लाया और वो फिर काफी आगे बढ़ा कि धर्म का विचार जो है वो दलित जो जब समाज है उसके उत्थान के लिए वो कैसे कर सकते हैं। और आप देखेंगे कि इसका जो साम्य है वो डॉक्टर बाबा साहेब अम्बेडकर ने जो बुद्धिज्म दिया है, बुद्धिज्म का फाउंडेशन ही है बहुजन हिताय बहुजन सुखाय। तो उसकी कितनी अच्छी कंपैरिजन हो सकती है इसकी वो कोशिश करें। दूसरी बात है कि आप यदि बाबा साहेब अम्बेडकर के वॉल्यूम पढ़े तो उसमें 2 लेक्चर है बाबा साहेब के जो जूस के प्रॉब्लम पे है। और ये एक इंटरव्यू है जो इजराइल की जो एम्बेसी के एम्बेसडर यहाँ थे, उन्होंने बाबा साहेब की इंटरव्यू। तो ये भी सामने है कि बाबा साहेब ने 2 बार जू कम्युनिटी के लिबरेशन के बारे में लिखा और एक जगह फिर वो ये कहते हैं कि आई एम मोजेस टू माय कम्युनिटी। तो इस तरह से वो कंपैरिजन बाबा साहब ने की है। डॉक्टर साइमन लॉरेंस ने उसको सब पढ़ा हुआ है। प्लीज ये बैकग्राउंड मुझे आपको देना था आज आपके साथ। तो ये शेयर करें कि लिबरेशन थियोलॉजी है क्या, ये कैसे शुरू हुई, तो इसका मतलब क्या है और इसका बाबा साहेब अम्बेडकर के साथ इसका क्या सामने है और दलितों के लिए इसकी क्या रिलेवेंस है। थैंक यू।
Thank you very much. At first, I'd like to thank everybody here and the leadership of your organization for inviting me to come today. It really is an honor for me to be here. And I hope there's an opportunity, whether today or some other time, to get to know some of you much better than we will tonight. Just a comment before I actually begin. You're going to hear me discuss figures from several faith traditions tonight, including the ancient Hebrews, of course, as well as Christian, especially Roman Catholic, Buddhism, and in a subsidiary role, Hindus who sought to break away from Hinduism and caste. This is not meant, none of my comments tonight are meant to proselytize in any way or to demean any faith. So let me begin by saying what is not a covenantal community. As you know, the title is From Moses to Ambedkar, the Story of Liberation Theology. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about the concept of a covenantal community, and I'll explain that. So first, let me try to explain what is not a covenantal community. As you know, far, far, far better than I could possibly, A caste system, of course, is an ancient form of social distinction among hereditary classes, with some inheriting exclusive privileges sanctioned by law, custom, or religion. While belief in the purity of lineage may be a source of pride in a cultural heritage, it may also lead to illusions of superiority and even lead to genocide, as in the Holocaust that befell the Jews of Europe at the hands of the master race. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were subjected to such concepts of purity of race and suffered genocide at the hands of European settlers. The concept of purity can evolve into rigid social hierarchies of privilege and pseudospeciation. Pseudospeciation is a term first used by the American psychologist Erik Erikson to describe marginalized groups considered so inferior that they have become distinct subpar species in the eyes of the oppressors. They become the other. The Rohingyas of Myanmar have lived under threat of expulsion. Blacks in apartheid states of Africa lived as a pseudo-species, providing cheap labor in forced-off Arab lands. The Jews of Imperial Russia were confined to the Pale of Settlement, where most lived in the poverty of their little towns, known as shtetls, subjected to routinized violence and limited to Jewish quotas for education. The Roman Catholic Church turned a blind eye worse to the persecution of Jews even during the Holocaust. Resurgent communal violence against Muslims in Sri Lanka, as in Myanmar, is today led by radical Buddhist clergy and lay people. The Roma people of Europe and the African American may live in multi-faith democracies, but racism against them persists. These are all caste-like social oppressions, often based on the origin myths of diverse peoples and faiths. Thank you. In countries with caste-bound poverty and inequality, social movements with religious leaders in the forefront have been an essential part of societal change for inclusive development. The Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu may have been the most recognizable and beloved figure internationally, yet many members of the South African clergy risked their lives to oppose apartheid. Or in the case of the Dutch Reformed Church, the major church of the Afrikaner population, it required a soul-searching overhaul of their beliefs. And then a quote from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee report of 1988, briefly. It said, some of the major Christian churches gave their blessing to the system of apartheid, and many of its early proponents prided themselves in being Christians. Indeed, the system of apartheid was regarded as stemming from the mission of the church. Religious communities also suffered under apartheid. Their activities were disrupted, their leaders persecuted, their land taken away. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples, often divided amongst themselves, spawned many of apartheid's strongest foes, motivated by values and norms coming from their particular faith traditions. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. marched and went to jail with Christian and non-Christian faith leaders of the United States of America. He carried in his pocket a book called The Prophets, a book written by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Clergy and theologians have been among the leadership of almost all social movements for equality in the United States, from the abolitionists against slavery in the mid-1800s to the anti-poverty moral revival movement today led by the charismatic Reverend William J. Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris. Involving thousands of Roman Catholic priests, sisters, and lay leaders with village-based comunidades de base, based Christian communities in the study of the Bible. Across many nations, often illiterate peasants and workers sat together to reflect on the social gospel of Jesus in the context of their intergenerational poverty their increasing landlessness and oppression, and in contrast to the hereditary privilege of landed elites. I therefore ask you about the lack of religious leadership against caste in the major faith of India that would be necessary for a theology of liberation to address the causal relationship between caste and poverty. We start then with the creation of the theology of liberation in the story of Moses that has been carried through the ages and across cultures, from Moses of the Old Testament to the American slave spiritual, that's right, thank you, to the American slave spiritual, go down Moses, way down in Egypt land, tell old pharaohs to let my people go. For centuries, the Exodus story has been cited in Jewish homes for the American Seder, a dinner commemorating the Passover, the Exodus. It begins with, "This is the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in the land of Mitzrayim," that is Hebrew for Egypt. "All who are hungry, let them enter and eat. All who are in need, let them come celebrate Passover. Now we are enslaved, next year we will be free." This is a dinner that has been going on for thousands of years to commemorate the Exodus from Egypt. The story of Exodus of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land has been described as an inexhaustible light for others oppressed. That light emanated from what was called the covenant with God, which continued through Christianity, the covenant that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, was first between God and Israel, and the second between God and mankind at large. It seeded the stirrings of discontent among peoples indoctrinated to accept their fated lowly place. It shone a light on a path that, though haltingly, led Moses to climb the mountain and to bring a higher purpose to his people. The story has taken on such life, for it is more than an escape from slavery. It is a story of being lost, far deeper than the boundaries of a desert. It is a story of a people without a guide, without a vision of authentic freedom that can only be achieved by the breaking of the shackles of the mind. It is a story of a journey from dissolution to peoplehood, connected by the eternal values of obligation and responsibility, not in a graded hierarchy, but in radical equality. This was the story very much in mind when Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar likened his own journey to that of Moses. In the story of Exodus, God did not deliver the people to the promised land, for it is said they wandered the desert for 40 years. They engaged in a long and arduous march, a march far longer than reason dictates, into a wilderness far beyond physical geography. God gave them an opportunity for freedom and self-affirmation. Yet deliverance meant struggle, doubt, and despair. Before they could enter the land of Israel, they had to shed the conditioning of slavery, overcome the mental state of oppression, and find the possibility of a new kind of community. That community was based on a code of conduct, commandments that discarded the master-slave relationship of the pharaohs, and one that ushered into history a society based on mutual obligations superior to the laws of man and beast. Moses began his own life journey unaware of his humble origins as a baby, hidden from the Pharaoh's genocide of all newborn Hebrew males. Found in a basket floating in the reeds of the Nile, the daughter of the Pharaoh named him Moses, meaning one drawn from the water. And though she must have known he was a Hebrew, brought him up in the splendor of wealth and privilege, for many that would have blinded them to injustice inflicted on the slaves. Yet Moses felt compassion for their misfortune. Perhaps it was at the beginning nothing more than pity, but the story attributes a growing consciousness to Moses, for over time he identified with these people thoroughly and bonded with their longing, as yet unformed but palpable in their anguish. The story of Exodus ultimately is about the covenant. More than a contract with God, it is a covenant among God's people to expect justice and to give justice, to live by that code of conduct in all relations within the community. The story of Exodus begins with a denial of justice and reaches its apex with the giving of the law. Thereafter, the story of liberation for the Jewish people becomes one for all humanity. We call that tikkun olam, to heal creation, to heal the world. The story of Exodus was not foreign to B.R. Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar wrote, he said, the story of the Jews told in the Old Testament is a moving tale. It has few parallels. The pathos inherent in the subjugation and ultimate emancipation of the Jews cannot but affect the emotions of those who are as depressed as the Jews who were in Egypt in the days of Pharaoh. But Bedkar continues, he says, but the heart of everyone who is working for emancipation of a depressed people is bound to go to Moses, the man who brought about the emancipation of the Jews. I confess, and Bedkar says, that if anything sustains me in my efforts to emancipate the depressed classes, it is the story of Moses undertaking the thankless but noble task of leading Jews out of their captivity. On August 14, 1931, Ambedkar had his first meeting with Mahatma Gandhi and brings up the idea of a homeland. Gandhiji, I have no homeland, he says. Gandhi mildly rebukes him and says, you have a homeland. I know you to be a patriot of sterling worth. And like Moses, Ambedkar pleads the case of his people. He said, how can I call this land my homeland and this religion my own, wherein we are treated worse than cats and dogs, wherein we cannot get water to drink? No self-respecting, untouchable, worth the name will be proud of this land. You see, for Moses, the promised land could only be found through an awakening to a covenantal community. And Ambedkar, I think, had a similar task to bring his people out of the endless oppression of submission to oppression to awareness of their full humanity. And Ambedkar, 2 years before his death, stresses the same urgent need. Ours is a battle not for wealth or for power. It is a battle for freedom. It is a battle for the reclamation of human personality. That is what Moses was trying to do. Only then would they know a homeland. The story of Exodus and the laws of Moses stand in stark contrast to the laws of Manu and to the ages that followed and justified the social divisions of caste as a recurring reality in a cosmic scheme of birth and rebirth that only allows a corruption of justice as lifelong punishment or reward. Many religions in their histories have been both oppressor and oppressed. The early Christians, as you know, were fed to the lions of Rome. Roman Catholic priests rode into South America with the conquistadors that unleashed centuries of genocide and slavery. And today, Israeli Jewish settlers appropriate Palestinian land in a quasi-religious fervor. And the great covenant of the Jewish people in Israel may have been shattered in Gaza in the last couple of years. Ask me later if you wish a further explanation for the pain I feel for the breaking of this covenant. There are terrorists who kill in the name of Allah. Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka and Myanmar lead violent attacks on Muslims in the name of Buddha. There are Hindus who still enforce untouchability despite constitutional safeguards and laws against caste-based atrocities. In Latin America, The hierarchy of a conservative church reinforced the privileges of a feudal system of separation of classes in an ever-deepening divide between the powerful and the poor. With few exceptions, and not until the early 20th century did the Latin American church begin a deep reflection on its own teachings. These were reinforced by a series of papal encyclicals on poverty and human dignity. Pope John the 23rd issued Pacem Terris in 1963. The encyclical opens with peace on earth, which man throughout the ages has so longed for and sought after, can never be established, never guaranteed, except by the diligent observance of the divinely established order. Yet the divinely established order of the encyclical is not the division of men and women into qualities that determine their rights and obligations. In contrast, Pope John the 23rd gives guidance to the faithful on safeguarding the personal freedom, dignity, and potential of all people on earth. He speaks of the inadequacy of institutions and customs and calls for the integration of faith and action based on love of all people. Francis, the first pope from Latin America and deeply steeped in liberation theology on his continent, continues the teaching on love and truth and social relations. In 2013, Pope Francis issued the Lumen Fidei. I quote it briefly. The Pope says, "The truth we seek, the truth that gives meaning to our journey through life, enlightens us whenever we are touched by love. One who loves realizes that love is the experience of truth, that it opens our eyes to see reality in a new way, in union with the beloved. In this sense," he says, St. Gregory the Great could write that love is itself a kind of knowledge possessed by its own logic. It is a relational way of viewing the world, which then becomes a form of shared knowledge, vision through the eyes of another, and shared vision of all that exists. Similarly important is the link between faith and the Decalogue in the Catholic Church. The Decalogue is their name for the Ten Commandments. Faith, as we have said, takes the form of a journey, a path to be followed, which begins with an encounter with the living God. It is in the light of faith, of complete entrustment to the God who saves, that the Ten Commandments take on the deepest truth. As seen in the words which introduce them, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." The Decalogue is not a set of negative commands, but concrete directions for emerging from the desert of the selfish and self-enclosed ego, in order to begin the dialogue into a dialogue with God, to be embraced by his mercy, and then to bring that mercy to others. Even before the 1968 Medellin Conference of Bishops in Medellin, Colombia, issued the revolutionary break between the Latin American church and the landed oligarchs, a movement of priests and sisters bolstered by Latin American theologians called for solidarity with the outcasts of their societies. The Catholic theologians of social liberation had a different challenge than the reformers of Hinduism. First, they believed fervently that the teachings of Jesus were consistent with the values of Exodus and the teachings of the Torah, the Jewish Bible. Liberation theologians believed that Jesus followed in the tradition of Jewish prophets with compassion for the poor and the hungry and righteous disdain for an uncaring rich. Second, Jesus' own words were definitive about human obligation. He spoke to his disciples at the Last Supper. He says in the Bible, "For I was hungry and you gave me meat. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came unto me." Then the disciples answered, somewhat in shock, "Lord, when did we see thee hungry and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger and took be in or naked and clothe thee? Or when saw thee sick or in prison or came unto thee? And the king, that is Jesus in the Bible says, shall answer and say unto them, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. He was identifying thoroughly with the poorest, most hungry child on earth. For a theology of liberation, this is the authentic meaning of the Eucharist. It is more than a ritual for the everyday person who comes to take the sacrament of bread and wine to embrace the presence of Jesus. For Jesus called the bread he lifted at the Last Supper the bread of affliction, harking back knowingly to the Exodus when the slaves hurriedly baked unleavened bread for their journey to liberation. The sacrament is a reminder of sacrifice and social justice. As you did it for the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. Hindu reformers have had a harder challenge. The foundational scriptures that shaped Hindu culture and society remain an impediment. I know there has been notable efforts at reforms within Indian and offshoots in Hinduism that tried to break free from caste itself. Does that offer hope for the present? Can the overwhelming dominance of today's religious culture in India evolve toward a covenantal society? Even in a Western nation, cultural legacies are hard to change. Even after 250 years of slavery in the United States, and over 400 years since the first slave ship docked at the colony of Virginia, after a constitutional amendment, another 100 years of discriminatory laws in many southern states, federal civil rights acts, and Supreme Court decisions overturning laws of separation of races, racism in America still exists. And racism is not that different from casteism. In India and wherever caste culture still exists, no religious or spiritual awakening has occurred on the scale necessary to finally rid India of its original sin. Ambedkar's social movement in the first half of the 20th century remains the most enduring of these efforts. He was benefited by and contributed to the emerging norms of human rights throughout the world and their articulation in high-level political forums, such as the United Nations General Assembly adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Nevertheless, Dr. Ambedkar's work was met with the resistance of an entrenched culture. And while the movement he led hoped beyond hope for a reformation of Hinduism, he called for its demise. And there is no figure in modern Indian history who did more to create a covenantal community among the oppressed than Dr. Ambedkar. For Ambedkar, a transformation must take place within the Hindu worldview, or Hinduism risks alienation from modern societies. It remains the dominant culture and has morphed into a political ideology. To tame it in the name of freedom requires a personal and social transformation of greater proportions, affecting not only the oppressed, but the oppressor in a quest for a common humanity. Both Ambedkar and the Latin American theologians of liberation believed their societies exhibited a social pathology. That pathology was found not only in the obscene attitudes of the oppressor, that pathology was also seen among the poor, in whom the weight of oppression had created a veil of piousness. The phase of the anti-caste movement today, called Dalit assertion, is a dramatic result of Ambedkar's mission, for it challenges the piousness and humility forced upon and conditioned by the overwhelming pressure of dependency within a dominant culture that dehumanizes and subjugates. Secondly, they believe that religions must confront their past in order to heal society. The Peruvian theologian, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, often called the father of liberation theology, said, "The denunciation of injustice implies the rejection of the use of Christianity to legitimize the established order." He goes on to say, "But the poor person does not exist as an inescapable fact of destiny. His or her existence is not politically neutral, and it is not ethically innocent. The poor," Father Gutierrez continues, "the poor are a byproduct of the system in which we live and for which we are responsible. They are marginalized by our social and cultural world. They are oppressed, exploited proletariat, robbed of the fruit of their labor, and despoiled of their humanity. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order." The Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa that I mentioned already, the major church of the Afrikaner people, taught for years the biblical justification of racial apartheid. As the anti-apartheid movement gained strength, it prompted their religious leaders to look inward, to search their souls and their understanding of their God. And they issued a deeply reflective apology to the black population of their country and embraced the liberation of all South Africans. Pope John II, as leader of the Roman Catholics, asked forgiveness for the sins and crimes committed in the name of his faith, with special reference to the persecution of Protestants, for the crimes of the Crusaders. He has asked forgiveness for the abuses of Europe's colonial era proselytizing around the world. He has voiced regret at the church's repression of Galileo. And the Pope was the first to visit a synagogue, and the Catholic bishops of Germany, Poland, Hungary, and France have apologized for their failure of their churches to oppose the Holocaust. To find the basis for a theology of liberation within the scriptural foundations and subsequent evolution of Hinduism, a respected leadership would have to emerge to speak directly to the destructive nature of caste and varna. Hinduism is highly decentralized, and there is no forum analogous to the Roman Catholic Vatican councils or the regional conferences of bishops. Yet the movement for liberation theology in Latin America began with scholars and activist priests and sisters and the nurturing of many thousands of base Christian communities to study the social gospel of Jesus, in the training of Hindu priests, monks, and other religious vocations would be needed to engage high and low caste communities in a similar effort of reflection and spiritual awakening to authentic social justice. Dr. Ambedkar did not believe it would ever happen. Even the celebrated Indian intellectual Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, who was an Indian politician, philosopher, and statesman who served as the president of India from 1962 to 1967, and who was truly no leader at all in the anti-caste movement, nevertheless, he said once, "If we are wedded overmuch to the rules of the past, if the living faith of the dead becomes the dead faith of the living, the civilization will die. We must make rational changes. If an organism loses the strength to excrete its own waste, it perishes. We cannot restore the practices of the Vedic period, for that would be to deny the dialectic of history," he says. In the history of every community, a time comes when radical changes in the social order are obligatory if the community is to exist as a living force and continue progress. To continue progress. We must purge, he says, society of man-made inequalities and injustices and provide for all equality of opportunity for personal well-being and development. He goes on to say, today we will be acting in the spirit of the Hindu tradition if those well-versed in our culture and keen on preserving the spirit bring about radical changes in our social organization. In India, we cannot wipe the slate clean and write a new gospel on virgin surface. We have changed so often in the past that a mere change does not disturb the spirit of the religion. Some of our institutions have become formidable obstacles to social justice and economic well-being, and we must strive to remove those obstacles, fight the forces which maintain superstition and transform the mind of the people. So let me conclude in this way. Of the reformers of Brahmanism, Buddhism is seen today as the most promising for a theology of liberation for India. Yet the chances of a massive revival of Buddhism in India perhaps seems fanciful. Ambedkar was prescient in creating a new space outside of Hinduism for the future anti-caste leaders. Within Hinduism, they would remain untouchable by the larger culture. But Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism, and with the mass conversion taking the vows with him in a public square, Ambedkar was most visibly the Moses of his people. In the space of 22 vows echoed by his people, he created the covenantal community as their spiritual homeland. Born in the 6th century before the Common Era, at what is today the frontier of India and Nepal, Buddha may not have led an overt social movement, yet his teachings implicitly created the potential for a new social landscape, renunciation of man's social order, and an affirmation of an ascetic brotherhood that transcended the taboos of society would in itself have been a stunning psychological liberation for the postulants, especially as most of the early adherents were high castes. Dr. Ambedkar wrote in Prologue of Annihilation of Caste that it is not possible to break caste without annihilating the religious notions on which the caste system is founded. So finally, let me say that for Ambedkar, humanization was an active conversion to Buddhism. And for his freedom to reject a state of mind, Ambedkar stands between Buddha and Moses, in my view. One represents the teaching of the Metta Sutta, the Buddha's practice of radiating kindness to all sentient beings without distinction. The other represents the giving of the law for a new and just social order. Ambedkar, like Moses, did not reach the promised land. Yet the values of the Exodus are alive in the Ambedkarite movement, insisting on the humanization of the oppressed and through the building of a new form of covenantal and Buddhist community in a secular and democratic India. Thank you. I hope that wasn't too much.